This time, we'll look at the question from the previous lesson. Can the to in, not to, sometimes be omitted?
Let's start with the question you raised last time. First, let's make sure what that question was. The example sentence comes from an English passage taken from Sociolinguistics, An Introduction to Language and Society, written in 1974 by the British sociolinguist Peter Trudgill. It can be embarrassing to be in the company of someone you are not acquainted with and not speak to them.
My question was why the to after not disappeared. I came across an explanation online saying that the part from to them is treated as a single unit. But I haven't been satisfied with that.
Do you remember what I said might be the reason why that explanation didn't convince you?
Yes. I took notes. 1. Is it ever possible for the to and not to disappear? 2. Why didn't the author follow the grammatical principle and write to be, and not to speak? To answer this question, we need to consider the difference between to be, and not to speak. And to be, and not speak. It seems reasonable to assume that the author deliberately omitted to after not with that difference in mind.
That's right. Before we answer these two questions, there's something I'd like to check first. You understand that the relative pronoun after someone is omitted, don't you?
Yes, I do.
Then how far does the relative clause extend? One possibility is that it ends at with. The other is that it goes all the way to them. Which do you think is right?
Probably up to with.
Why do you think so?
If we assume the relative clause goes all the way to the end, then the not after and becomes problematic. Accepting that not would mean accepting a form like are not speak.
That's a good point. And there's one more thing. What does them at the end refer to?
Someone, I think.
Exactly. Someone is treated as singular, but it's commonly referred to with plural pronouns like they, their, or them. If we assume that the relative clause extends all the way to them, that would lead to a problem. For example, if you translate a person you know as a person that you don't know him. What's wrong with this sentence?
The him at the end is unnecessary.
Right. Since a person has been fronted as the antecedent of the relative clause. Leaving him in the object position is incorrect.
So the relative clause has to end before and, right?
That's correct. Now let's move on to the main issue. Question 1. Is it possible for the to and not to disappear? Could you pronounce these two expressions? First, how do you pronounce not to?
Not to.
How many times did you pronounce the T sound?
Once, I think.
Now try not.
Not.
How many T sounds did you pronounce this time?
Once.
In both cases, it's just once. So they end up sounding almost the same, right?
Yeah. So does that mean not to and not are pronounced the same?
Not exactly. In not to, the T in not practically disappears, and the following, to, is pronounced relatively strongly. In not, the T is extremely weak and barely audible.
So does that mean people sometimes mistake not for not to in writing?
They don't. In pronunciation, they're very similar. So it can sound that way. In pronunciation, it seems as if the following to were absorbed into the T of not, so more precisely, it's perceived that way.
It doesn't actually disappear, does it?
Right. It doesn't disappear, it just sounds that way.
Basically, you can't omit the to and not to, but since not to and not sound very similar, does that mean that in some situations, people might write not where not to should be written?
That relates to the second question we're about to consider. Why did the author write to be and not speak instead of to be and not to speak? But before we think about that question, let's consider the meaning of the following sentence.
It means A and B, right?
Then what does this sentence mean?
A and B is, maybe.
Since both A and B are in the subject position, seems strange, doesn't it? A and B are, would make sense. But the verb is indicates that the subject is singular.
That's true. Then,
As I just said, if the verb is singular, we can regard the subject as one unit. If we interpret it as doing A and then doing B, one continuous, unified action, then the verb becomes is.
So, A and B can have two meanings.
Exactly. One meaning is A and B, or doing A and doing B, two separate things or actions. The other meaning is doing A and then doing B, one continuous, unified action.
If the phrase A and B comes as the subject, we can tell which meaning it has by looking at the verb. But in this case, since it's a formal subject, we have to judge from the meaning.
Right. Now, if we express the sentence in question as, it can be embarrassing to be in the company of someone you are not acquainted with and not to speak to them. What impression do you get?
Since both infinitive phrases have to, given that the first is A and the second is B, it feels like they are two separate, independent units.
Before thinking about the meaning of this sentence, there's something we should confirm first. Company here doesn't mean corporation, right?
Yes, I knew that. It means being with someone.
Right. In the company of someone means when you are with someone. And can express as possibility, may, or can sometimes. Keeping those in mind, could you translate the sentence?
Being in the company of someone you are not acquainted with and not speaking to them can sometimes be embarrassing. To be in the company of someone you're not acquainted with, and not speak to them, feel disconnected, so something sounds a bit odd.
Yeah, it sounds off. Now let's look at the original version, without the second to. It can be embarrassing to be in the company of someone you are not acquainted with and not speak to them.
Being in the company of someone you're not acquainted with and yet not speaking to them can sometimes be embarrassing. I see. So the writer omitted the second to make to be, the A part. And not speak, the B part. One continuous unit.
Exactly. There are people who simply write down what they hear and drop the to and not to, since the pronunciation can sound almost the same. But that's not something you should imitate casually. At least in this case, omitting the second to in order to unify A and B into one continuous action is a logical and meaningful choice.
Next time, we'll take a look at the expression be to.